So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to this knowledge exchange event. I'm Abby Stone, so if you don't know me already, but I think most of you do, I'm the Communications and Knowledge Exchange Officer for the Future of UK Treescapes programme. So I thought I'd just start really quickly by going over the Zoom guidance or the house rules. So while other people are speaking, if you could just keep your microphone switched off, that would be really helpful for us. If you've not already done so, and I actually haven't done this either, but please could you put your affiliation next to your name on Zoom. If you're part of a project, put your project affiliation, that'd be really helpful. If not, just put your company. This session will be interactive throughout, so if you have any questions at any point, you can pop them in the chat and we'll be monitoring that, or you can use the Zoom features to raise your hand or give a wave on your camera or something like that. And just note to say that this event is being recorded. We might share it on our YouTube afterwards and with people who can't be here. So just bear that in mind for whatever you're saying. And now that's out of the way, I'll just go through what we can expect for the day. So first, the introduction from me, which we're doing now. Then we're going to go into communicating complex information, which is going to be delivered by some lovely people at the Tree Council. Then we'll have a short break at around 11:45. And then we'll come back and Elisa Gilbert from the Grantham Institute will be giving or hosting a kind of discussion around reaching out to decision makers and policy makers. Then I'll be taking back over at 12:20 to run us through a workshop activity, and we should be all wrapped up and finished by 1. So just before I pass over to the first speaker, I just wanted to talk a little bit through why we've kind of set up this event. So a lot of us will already know that there are ambitious targets for tree planting over the next decade or so, which means that it's going to have massive impacts for everybody in the UK. And this puts a lot of pressure on us to communicate effectively with decision makers and the people who are going to be affected. And just close my window there. So in the past, during research programs like this, a lot of the projects have gone full force into their communications activities, but without thinking through some of the possible pitfalls that could come up, or they've used scattergun approaches, just throwing out their messages and hoping something sticks. And what this has ultimately meant for a lot of those projects in the past is that their communications activities and efforts have been in vain and haven't had the impact that they wanted. So we just thought that as this is such an important thing for our programme to communicate effectively, we wanted to set up this event about communicating effectively with particular audiences. So with that said, I will pass over to the first speakers, which Jess Allen, Claire and John from the Tree Council. So I'll just stop sharing and then you should be allowed to.
Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen. So hopefully this is going to work. Can you just let me know if that you can see?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay. Hi, yeah, it's lovely to see you all this morning, and I hope it's not too hot where you are, and hopefully you can get outside after this session, which will be good. Thanks, Abby and Clive, for having us and for setting up the workshop. It's really nice to be here today. So yeah, we're going to talk a bit about communication and specifically about how we communicate about trees and how we connect with people to inspire action. So I'm Jess and I'm the Science and Research Project Manager at the Tree Council. I work on various collaborative research projects, particularly on tree health and local tree strategies. John, do you want to say hello as well?
Yeah, hi, so I'm John. I'm Director of Tree Science and Research here at the Tree Council. And Claire?
And I'm Claire, I'm the Director of Programmes and Comms. Good to see you all.
And just to warn you, at the end of our session, just so that you're all got a heads up, we're having a cameras on talking session. So if you're all hiding behind your cameras off, there will come a moment when we're going to say cameras on. So just to warn you.
Great,
Jess.
thanks. So just to give you an overview of what we're talking about, we'll tell you a bit about the Tree Council and the types of stakeholders and audiences that we work with in our day-to-day work. And then Claire and I will talk through some specific case studies to give you some insights onto the approaches and techniques that we use to get messages across. And then finally, we'll show you some final tips. And then John, as he said, is going to run a short exercise with you to get you thinking about how to come up with simple and effective messages. So hopefully you are all aware of the Tree Council, but just in case, we're a national charity that brings together people and organisations interested in trees. And we have 4 main strands as shown on the slide here. So firstly, through our network of tree wardens and community groups, we work at the heart of local communities to help them fund and tree planting and care for those trees and hedges. Secondly, our education team work with a network of hundreds of schools and also with young tree champions. And that's trying to inspire the next generation of environmentalists and help them to articulate their feelings about nature and climate change and those topics. Thirdly, we also support practical science and research like this. And we work particularly closely with Forest Research, Ferroscience and DEFRA on tree health issues. And of course, we're involved in collaborative projects like this one, but lots of other ones too. And last but not least, we bring people together to influence policy. For example, through chairing committees. So John chairs HedgeLink, which is the National Hedgerow Committee, and also working alongside other environmental organisations just to champion trees in the policy space. So for us, communicating about trees is kind of our day-to-day job. It's our full-time role, really. So we wanted to sort of start by taking a step back and thinking about why this is important. And I think it comes down to this kind of reflection that trees and people are so interlinked. And these lists show how people influence trees and how trees influence people. Obviously, that's not exhaustive, and I'm sure among us we could come up with many, many more. Obviously, we're in a very human landscape in Britain, and the vast majority of trees will in some way be influenced by people. And that can be practical things like planting or felling, through to more sort of abstract things like land use policy. And obviously that's policy is a key area that needs influencing over the next few years to make sure that our treescapes are resilient and protected. And on the other side, we have trees. I think we all know the positive things that trees bring to us. So from climate regulation to food sources, and to more kind of, again, abstract things like connection to history and to our past. But I think it's also important to recognise that trees can be perceived by some people as risks or nuisances. It's not universal that people love trees. And also our influence on trees can obviously be negative. And the point is that we want to make sure that these interactions are really positive ones as much as possible, and that we as a society take care of trees as much as they take care of us. I was thinking it's like any long-term relationship, really. Communication and understanding is really key to a healthy partnership. So hopefully together collectively we can give trees a voice and help people to articulate what they want in the treescape. And following on from that, I think it's important to reflect that people, so your audience, have limited time and attention to pay to anything. They're going to have different interests and different priorities and sometimes conflicting pressures. And we know also that it's difficult, it can be difficult for all of us to find time to think about comms throughout projects. But this diagram here trying to make that point that what you want to say and what the audience is interested in might be quite different. And it's important to find where the overlap is and what resonates with people. And hopefully you can then, once you hook them into your message, you can have some constructive engagement. So just to touch on understanding audiences, the Tree Council has quite a diverse range of audiences, depending on what projects we're working on. Some of the key ones are shown here. I think one that's quite good to highlight is the top one, so BLIC and volunteers, because that has quite a range of different types of knowledge and people even within that group. So for example, we have volunteer tree wardens who know far more about trees than I probably ever will. And then we also have people who might not understand tree biology or technical terms at all. And so you might have to accommodate lots of different and diverse knowledge within the same activity. And similarly with local authorities, we do a lot of work with, they have lots of different roles and individuals within those groups. And it can be useful to think through the different individuals and break down those kind of things that are easy to see as one group, but actually include lots of different nuances. And these photos here show John showing some of our tree wardens how to prepare and gather seeds. And below we have our educators delivering a discovery day. And so, yeah, the key message here is to identify your audience early on in the process. Think about who you're creating messages and outputs for, and what their needs are. And yeah, I thought it would also be useful to reflect on the point that we can all apply good comms in all of our interactions with people. So sometimes with these kind of projects that have lots of different partners and disciplines and work packages, it can be quite difficult to have in your head some simple messages about what that project's trying to achieve. So it might be useful to think about that in your individual projects. Does everyone feel equipped to be ambassadors for those projects when they're talking to policymakers or committees or landowners? And hopefully that can maximise impact. And here's a photo of John. I think he's talking about some rare white beams there with the England Woodland Biodiversity Group. So getting them outside and showing them what we really mean. Yeah, so now I'm going to talk you through our work on ash dieback. And then after that, Claire's going to talk about our National Hedgerow Week campaign from last year. So two contrasting examples. So I'm sure, sadly, you're probably all aware of ash dieback and the fact that it's the most significant tree disease to affect the UK since Dutch elm disease. It's been detected here since 2012, probably was around earlier. And with ash being a really common tree, this could have quite it will have a fundamental impact on our landscape. As the name suggests, infected trees die back and they can become brittle and really unsafe and difficult to manage safely for landowners and local authorities. So our aims here are really to make sure that people are equipped with the necessary information, that we're communicating the learning that's being generated, and that we're empowering those key stakeholders to make strategic decisions about response and recovery. And I was thinking that this could be quite a useful example because it's so challenging to talk about. So for example, it's a really complex topic. It's quite dynamic. There's lots of technical concepts and evidence emerges and comes to light or learning more. It's also clearly negative. So it can be quite upsetting and difficult for people to hear about if they love trees. There are diverse stakeholders, so from local authorities to the public, landowners and foresters with very different backgrounds and outlooks on treescapes. Obviously, the public safety element it also adds an additional challenge in terms of communication and producing guidance and advice for people. And finally, there was an urgency to make people aware about ash dieback, but we also don't want to cause panic and have unhelpful reactions. So it's important to tread carefully and really think how people respond to what you're saying. And I thought it might be interesting or worthwhile for you all to consider whether there's any particular challenges or barriers associated with the topics you're working on as well. So I was picking John's brains the other day about how the last decade in ash dieback has unfolded really from the start, and we put together this diagram. Obviously it was taken really seriously by government. I think the key point there was like identifying who the key stakeholders were and making sure that their needs and their organisational structures and decision-making processes were really well understood. So for the Tree Council, that involved running lots of research workshops and really getting to know the audience and stakeholders really deeply, understanding their day-to-day challenges as well as their kind of bigger strategic ones. And that was really important for then developing effective resources that were tailored to them and also feeding into the ongoing support and communications that was undertaken. And we're kind of in this loop now on the right-hand side of continuing to gather evidence. New stakeholders come to light as the disease progresses, and we adapt the resources that we have. So as I said, key audiences were local authorities and large landowners, but also the public. And we've worked on behalf of DEFRA and Scottish Government to produce these toolkits and guidances. So all the toolkits generally use quite simple language, and they define all the technical terms that are used in them. And we avoid using lots of long sentences or paragraphs, which is obviously quite a common sense thing to do, but can be easy to fall into those traps. And I know John and Claire spend a lot of time reading things out loud to make sure that it really flows and makes sense to a reader. So that's a kind of practical tip if you don't already do that at the moment. So the guidance for the public was obviously a bit shorter. They're still educational and informative, but they really encourage people to seek professional advice. So you're directing them to an appropriate professional. Whereas the toolkits for local authorities are quite focused on strategic responses and overcoming particular challenges that they face. And so, yeah, so I'm going to share a few extracts from the toolkit for the local authorities. So firstly, it's important to capture your audience's attention and encourage them to act in the way that you want. So firstly, thinking through what key decision makers in local authorities, for example, respond to. One thing is their budget. So this is an extract from the toolkit, which is a real example of a county council's budget implications. I think quantifying this and presenting big numbers and hard numbers was a good way to get their attention. And so yeah, it goes back to understanding the audience. Some people might not respond to the fact emotionally that trees are being lost, but they will respond to financial implications. And again, quite another common sense thing really, but wherever possible with a complex topic, we try to present information visually. And again, it seems like common sense, but it's important not to overlook opportunities to do that. And it's also worth testing diagrams with a sample of your audience if you possibly can, or with someone who's not familiar with the topic, and see whether it makes sense to them without needing to explain the point you're making. And often it can also be useful to co-design them, so work alongside someone from your target audience to see whether you can come up with something better together than separately. And another well-recognised thing that we use a lot is that individuals respond much more, seem to respond better to information coming from their peers rather than coming from people they perceive as sort of external experts. So wherever we can, we use relatable examples and try and make sure that they're quite diverse so that different audiences can pick and choose the ones that they relate to. And we see that if you're doing communications in webinars or seminars as well. It's worth throwing in, if you can, a case study or a real story into the mix. I think that's quite an engaging way to communicate with people. And in terms of sort of traditional comms activities, I think with a high stakes topic like this, it was important to think about the comms activities really strategically and make sure it's appropriate to the seriousness of the situation. So for Ash Dieback, events and workshops online for local authorities can work really well for keeping people engaged. For example, this year, we knew that managing ash dieback along roads was a particular area of concern, so we held some specific workshops on that, which brings in your audience, and then you can show them the rest of the resources and guidance that you're producing. And yeah, make sure that you're, if you've got a dynamic situation like this, that you're keeping up to date with the audience and their needs. And we don't do lots of high profile sort of proactive comms on social media or things like that, because we obviously don't want to cause panic about ash trees. So we're more targeted about cascading information to the right level through our kind of existing networks, which could be tree wardens or other sort of local authority contacts. And so all the work that John and Claire and the team have done over the last few years has led to 20,000 downloads of the toolkit, and a significant amount of money hopefully unlocked for local authority tree officers to start managing this issue. And I think this level of engagement, it reflects the scale of the issue, but also the effectiveness of the comms that the research partners and government partners have undertaken. And we're always trying to evaluate that and learn and keeping to improving. So just a quick summary, if you're trying to communicate something complex, find out what aspects might capture your audience's attention and what might resonate with them. Tailor resources to different audiences, use visual presentation and bring other voices to the forefront where you can, where that's helpful, and also consider the potential inadvertent consequences of media and tread carefully in serious topics like this. And with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Claire, who's going to talk about something much more positive.
John, might you respond to the question in the chat about what ash dieback panic might look like before I start? Just briefly, you're on mute.
The questions asked what would panic look like. Panic would look like mass felling, unnecessary, overzealous felling. It might lead to landscape change on a huge scale. It also might lead to people doing dangerous things, taking down trees when they're not skilled to do so. And the real risk is of death of people. We've got quite a few tree surgeons who have now been killed because of ash dieback. And when Dutch elm disease hit, and Clive did a lot of work on this back in the 80s, when people died of ash dieback, they were usually the untrained who were killed because they weren't qualified to do the work. So panic looks like unprovoked, unsuitable reaction by people who are not skilled, which could lead to death, or landscape scale change in a way that is unmanaged. And all of that is the danger of poor comms. And so, as Jess has set out, it's been a really interesting journey to try and navigate our way through the knife edge that is out and out panic versus complete disregard and it becoming too late, so that we end up in the same situation. It's been a very interesting comms debate.
Great, thank you. Right, so thank you, Jess. I'm going to be talking about a much more light-hearted topic, but yet still really quite a serious one. The Tree Council were championing hedgerows, are sort of championing hedgerows, thanks to a grant from the Green Recovery Challenge Fund last year. And we decided to launch the very first ever National Hedgerow Week. And so it's a public awareness campaign, which it's never easy to launch a brand new campaign in that way, especially when the topic is hedges. Hedges are often overlooked by many. They're not particularly valued as a result. They're not as cute as hedgehogs or as high profile as trees and forests, and they're not as endangered as tigers and pandas. So really quite a challenge to capture the public's attention. Yet there is a very real need to better manage the hedges, and the Climate Change Committee has recommended planting, I think it's 200,000 kilometres by 2050 to help combat climate change and reach net zero. So it is a very serious message. So our challenge is to find a way of capturing the general public's attention. And we decided, after much debate, to take a quirky approach to the campaign. Next slide, Jess, please. Okay, so we decided to focus, we decided to harness the power of words, basically, for this. There are so many different messages that you could tailor to so many different audiences, but we just sort of boiled it down to a very simple campaign, social media campaign mainly, where we were looking at encouraging people to appreciate things like the carbon absorbing, pollution busting, wildlife boosting power of hedges. So really translating some key messages in a slightly original way. Words have got the power to tell amazing stories and bring things to life. And so language really, really matters when it comes to connecting people with the environment. So our talk to the hedge campaign was urging people to take notice of their hedges, of their local hedges, those in their gardens, on their doorsteps, and to experience amazing things that go on inside them. We focused on devising some quirky imagery with some not so willing volunteers and lots of colourful language to describe hedges in really quite straightforward but precise ways. As we know, hedges are the hidden heroes and sleeping beauties of our streets and countryside, and they've all got a slightly different story to tell. So this was a really playful way to start an important conversation about these beautiful, bountiful, bustling habitats and their essential roles that they have to save the planet. Next one, Jess. Thanks. So we produced, to help people talk to the hedge, because it's obviously a little bit unusual, we created lots of engaging social media content with some really short key messages in sort of original ways. I think if you can't tell a story in a few words, it's probably not worth saying at all. We were just trying to really condense it down, and we provided a guide as well, which included words and phrases and bringing some positive poetry and complement their hedges. So it was all about really raising awareness and helping people get outside. This was post-pandemic, so the timing was good. Next one, Jess. The sort of underlying message for the campaign was really to encourage people to take practical action. So it wasn't all talk, it was encouraging people to take practical action, encouraging people to let their hedges grow, so promoting better hedge management, encouraging them to leave the bottoms of hedges nice and messy. That was a double-edged sword, because in urban areas they can often collect litter, which can be perceived, which give a bad name to hedges. So we're encouraging people. I think there was also a litter campaign going on, so we could tie it in with that, encourage people to pick up litter from the bottom of hedges. And we held a series of educational sort of and interesting hedge talks, sort of webinars online. And we also encourage people to, if they couldn't do any of those, or if they wanted to, an extra, to pledge a hedge, to raise funds for more hedge planting across the country. So in addition to that, we're very aware there's a huge amount, as part of our Close the Gap hedgerow project, there was a huge amount of research on hedges out there, and sort of information, so many different organisations involved. And so we've been focusing on developing a hedge hub, that we've called it. So it's a knowledge hub of lots of useful information and latest research and everything. So we've developed this, and we're going to be pointing people to that knowledge hub for more information. Practical, everything we do has to focus on really practical information that people can apply in their day-to-day lives. Final slide, please, Jess. So just the results of the campaign. It was the very first year, so it was always going to be interesting to see how it went, and actually we were really quite pleased. We captured the imagination of BBC Radio 4 Gardeners Question Time. Our CEO featured on there on BBC News. That image was the one in the middle appeared in the Times and the Financial Times and others. We were delighted we work in partnership with our Close the Gap partners, but also our wider membership, and we had lots of organic sort of social activity going on with friends, and others like Woodland Trust and Kew Gardens and DEFRA and others were sharing the content online, and it captured people's imagination. For example, the poet Pam Ayres she wrote a poem on hedges, and she shared it on her platform, where she had 73,000 Twitter followers. So it really did start sort of gaining some momentum. I think John's going to talk about National Hedgerow Week 2022, and we would love to hear your thoughts on how we might build on everything that we've done. But I hope that this has just given you a flavour of a slightly different approach. It's aimed at the general public. It's always difficult to get these sort of key environmental messages across, and sometimes taking a humorous approach just helps capture people's imagination. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Claire. So we've just got some final takeaway tips, which kind of summarises what we've been talking about. So I know we haven't got much, but just to pick a few, I think telling a story that relates to what Claire was saying about hedgerows, using technical terms and acronyms and things like that considerately. So for me, I think it's okay to use them if you define them, and make sure that you present. It's more about presenting concepts simply in a way that can be understood. And if you don't use technical terms, sometimes that can be a bit disempowering for people if they want to then go on and find out more. and the language then doesn't match up with other information they see. And then to pick another one, finally, just connect with existing initiatives and networks. That could probably save you time and resources, and also you might find that there's lots of willing volunteers and organisations that are out there to help you. And I think if we at the Tree Council can help, I think we'd be pleased to have conversations and see how we can help you. So yeah, we're going to stop there for some questions before the workshop. John, you're muted, I think. Are you talking?
Yeah, so if you take down, if we go to camera so that we can start seeing people. So if you take the presentation down, I think it was Einstein that said, if you can't put everything you know about a subject on one sheet of paper, then you don't know enough about the subject. And the art of a lot of this is about how do you convey a really complicated topic in a short, snappy, but an accessible way. And one of the interesting parts we find with DEFRA, for example, is they do masses and masses of research, but it never makes the light of day because it's impenetrable, it's jargon laden, it's all the things that Jess has said. So what we decided we would try and do is explore that with you in a second, and see if you can come up within 5 minutes something that might push you out of your comfort zone just a tiny bit. So we will explore that in just a sec. But as Jess said, were there any questions to Claire or to Jess about anything that was just been said? The answer is there has to be. We're not accepting. So you can't just sit and look at us now. You have to actually talk to us.
John, I was just wondering, the question I always have in the back of my head is how lasting are the impacts of campaigns or interventions like the hedgerow initiative, for instance?
So I think the answer to that, Clive, is you never absolutely know for certain, except if you see a change in public awareness or public uptake of a topic. And one-hit wonders we've discovered over the years don't do it. If you do it once, it probably doesn't usually, unless it has a particular topic. And Kate's just said plant a tree in 73. That actually was organisationally us. That was where our organisation started, plant a tree in 73. It then went plant some more in 74, still alive in 75, dead as sticks in 76. So, but people remember that for the positive and the bad, the good and the bad, 50 years on. And it is, in fact, our 50th anniversary next year, 2023, which is part of the journey. And we, Tree Council, are here because we're part of the Connected Treescapes project that Julia is here to represent this morning. So we are part of our collective team. And I think for us, there's a huge amount of research that's going to go on in this project over the next 2 years, 3 years. But how do we get it out there? How do we make people aware? And it doesn't just become £10 million worth of academic research that nobody ever gets to see. What is it that matters out of all that you're doing that we need to go and sell to people so that their lives change because of this research? That's, for us, the really intriguing part. So, Clive, the answer is it's very difficult to know, but we have to look at trying to change people's opinions.
You're kind of saying that kind of repeated campaigns that repeat, or interventions that are scheduled and they kind of repeat again and again is a good approach. So National Tree Week, for instance, or your hedgerow week. And
National Tree Week we've been running for 50 years, so people know that National Tree Week is the point at which you plant trees. It just is part of the. And so, yes, that repeat process of different versions of, but similar messaging. So hence National Hedgerow Week Year 2. That's what we believe is the really critical part of good ongoing comms.
Yeah.
Claire, do you want to come back on that at all?
No, I totally agree. It has to be an ongoing exercise, but also a sort of a constant chatter during the year with the real focus on that week. But there's so many other things to do. So with National Tree Week, there are other seasonal campaigns in place as well. So we have seed gathering season in the build up to it. So it enables us to talk about trees and highlight things like that. At the moment, it's our Trees Love Care campaign. And you know, it's important just to keep the conversations going throughout the years in different ways.
And Clive, that's why we're interested in the conversation between the whole Treescapes programme and National Tree Week for next year. It's in our 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
And all of the work that we are collectively doing has the potential to really say something important. There's a thread going on in the chat from Kate and others about how we engage with children. And there is that element of hopeful, but there is also that element of afraid, and the balancing act. It's like the ash dieback. How far do you go on the afraid part of the spectrum so that people actually are almost paralyzed into doing something without giving a bit of hope? That means you feel you can. It's that knife edge of doing the right thing, but in the context of, oh, there's something a bit scary over here, but I can do something about it over here. Hope and fear in equal measure along that balancing edge. Too much fear and you paralyze activity. Too much hope and you paralyze activity. Finding the middle ground is the interesting part of comms. It is about empowering them, but empowering them to make an active role in doing something going forward. So I can't remember how we are for time, Abby, but are we into workshop time?
Yes, we are into workshop time.
So look, we're going to spend 5 minutes and we're going to pick your brains, okay? This year, National Hedgerow Week is going to happen in the autumn. So last year we did it in the spring. This year we're doing it this autumn. And we thought, just to get you into the mindset of conveying complicated information in as short a way as possible, we want you to come up with, in the next 5 minutes, a strap line for National Hedgerow Week for this year, with the theme being around these enormous, as Claire said, valuable priority habitats, which will be producing food because it's autumn this autumn. So there's your 2 bits of information. You heard from Claire how important hedges are. And this autumn, it's about food and food production. So I want from all of you, spoken or written, a 5-word, 6-word, maximum 10-word campaign slogan. The point of all this is not that we want your although if they're really, really fabulous, we will explore with you using them. But it's trying to convey, as Claire showed you, something complicated. Hedges matter. Hedges are important. Big priority habitat. George Eustace said in the spring, the most important building blocks in our landscape. How do you convey that to an audience using the vehicle of National Hedgerow Week? And you have the audience, to take Jess's point, is set. It is the public, the general public. So that's your target. National Hedgerow Week is your vehicle, and the opportunity is September and food. So we thought you'd give you a couple of minutes to go and grab a cup of tea or have a think, and come back in at 11:45 and stick your ideas, your thoughts in the chat. Put your microphone on, tell me what you think, and we will discuss what you've come up with. Come back to me. Let's have a look at some of your suggestions. Let's have a look at some of your ideas. I do like the first one, ramble in the bramble. And one of the things that we've learnt over the years is that alliterative headlines do help. Just getting silly, short, 3-line, 3-word alliterative headlines do help. But it's then about what does that mean? You know, what is the alliteration trying to tell you? And it is good advertising. It's just comms. Comms is largely about advertising. Hedgerows, great for crumbles and for brumbles. You see, I like that one. So it's that element of a bit of fun, a bit of entertainment. A tonic for the birds as well as the gin. You see, there's that nice art of play of language, linguistic playfulness, and that's again what we tried to do with some of those headlines for the National Hedgerow Week. We had an advertising agency that we literally spent about 3 hours, everybody just sitting down doing what we're doing, coming up with some daft ideas, some daft headlines, and that is never time wasted. So in all of your projects, it would be worth sitting down with each other and doing this same game. Play. How do we package this in 5, 6, 7 words? Because if you can do that for your project, back to Einstein, keeping it short means that you understand it. How do you articulate what you're doing in as few words as possible? Fabulous food for hedgerow. I missed a few, but jammed with fruit. Nice. Fabulous, because again, there's a play in words. Fabulous food for hedgerow foragers. So that one doesn't, with apologies, Morag, that doesn't quite, to me, there's one word too many. And that gets down to personal. This is not a criticism per se, it's just me. I like 3 and 4 word ones. I just like it short and snappy. Hedges in edges. I like it, but what's it saying? So you've also got to be clear about the messaging that you're trying to get over. Swap, I'm just whizzing down through a few. Help yourself to hedgerow harvest this autumn. You see, hedgerow harvest is nice. Food for free. Swap Waitrose for hedgerows. Yeah, I love that one. That's one that you could. So you get the idea that what it's about is about finding a simple way of articulating something complicated. And Clive said earlier, what are the point of these things? Well, if you can get a phrase like plant a tree in 73 that lodges in people's brains, that is where that's the holy grail of all this stuff. It's the holy grail of all good advertising, is to find a phrase that lodges in people's brains. So how are we doing for time, Abby?
Yeah, I was just about to say we need to move on to the next session, I think. So we just
which is
wrap up.
fine. So thank you all for all of those. Remember that, because at the end of the session, Abby's going to be doing another workshop where we try and find out about your projects a bit more. But remember the advertising principle of short, sharp, 3-5 words, and try and convey those complicated things that your projects are telling us about the world. It shows no inflation. You see, if it makes you laugh, then there is also something good in your messaging. So apologies if I didn't read yours out. Thank you for all of those. They are some really nice. But what we hope we've taken from this morning is that, from our bit of this morning, is that art of communicating something complicated is as much art as it is science. And I know there are lots of you in this room that are from the artistic part of the academic spectrum. It's from the linguistic part of the spectrum. It's using all the pool talents that exist in this room to start thinking about how we package this project, this program, in a way that means that we maximize in the long term the value of all your work by getting it to the right audience. And the key in that sentence is the right audience. And we will have different ways of packaging all the stuff for different audiences. And I think we're now going to move on to the next part of the equation, which is a different audience. Ours was the public. I think we're now going to go on and look at the policymakers.
Yeah. So we were supposed to have a break now, but hopefully everybody had a chance to get a cup of tea or do whatever they needed during that last bit of the workshop. So with permission from Elisa and you guys in the audience, we'll go on to the next session. And then I might just give a 2-minute break between this session and the workshop, just to give people a chance to do whatever they need to do then. So Elisa, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Abby. It's a hard act to follow. I think basically while you were doing that presentation, I decided I want to work for the Tree Council. It's basically like my presentation now. Oh my
Good
gosh, I love
advertising.
trees and I love what you do, and it's brilliant. I looked at your website. I just realized the only reason I can't apply right now is I need to figure out what my favorite tree is, and I think that like you all have that on the website, but I don't think I can make a choice. It's too hard. Anyway, apart from me writing a job application right now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and why Abby invited me to come along. So I work at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, which is an institute at Imperial College, which is where Clive and Abby also work. Not at the institute, but we work at the same university. And my role there is very unusual. Well, it's got an unusual job title, Director of Policy and Translation, where translation is translating all kinds of academic expertise into different formats and ways of communicating them so that they can have an impact on making a difference, particularly around the challenges of climate change and other environmental challenges. That means essentially and together with my team, we act as a two-way valve between some of the audiences that we think can be really influential in changing the way in which humans engage with our environment and the kind of ways that we can have an influence on the climate in particular, but also other kinds of environmental issues. For you, that might include things like invasive species or biodiversity loss and other issues that we associate with treescapes and similarly. So what Abby asked me to talk a little bit about is how do we think about impact with these audiences? The majority of my experience has been with policymaking audiences, but I'm going to talk to you in more general terms about impact first. And I hope this can be a conversation rather just a one-way presentation. So I am going to be stopping now and then and asking you things. So please do join in or pop in. You've been very active in the chat also as well so far. So I'm going to just share my screen now. Okay, so I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about science and global challenges. So there's really a lot of ways in which scientific information can be used to tackle climate change, but here we've got all kinds of just imagery that relates to different types of global challenges, and perhaps even by looking at these pictures, it makes you think about some of the ways in which science or activities around things like trees can have an influence on these global challenges. For me, some of this imagery is quite meaningful. So you look at this tree with the piles of coins under it, and immediately I have some quite strong emotions about things like natural capital, valuation of nature and trees, and both the good and the harm that I think that can do. But you can see that there are lots of significant challenges here: flood and drought, and the impacts of climate change or environmental degradation. And you can see trees in those images, but they have an influence also on what we can do about those challenges. So first kind of question for you all is, how do you think, what are the ways in which science actually engages with these global challenges? What's the role? It is not a kind of meant to be a really difficult technical question. I just want to know how you think that we can see links between these different things. Put up your hands or something so I can see.
They're not playing now, are they, Alicia?
No, I know. Very quiet, very quiet. I know that everyone has lots of emails to answer, but if while we're having the conversation, you can be a little bit present. Yes. Surely that because you're here, you have a feeling that there is some reason why, some connection between the science that you're all doing or the other kinds of research that you're doing and tackling global challenges.
Geraint said in the chat, Alicia, that science is a solution to all is a suggestion that's come in there.
Okay, great. Science is a solution to all. That's great and bold. There's a little eyebrow movement from you, Clive. Go on.
and I was going to be rather more conservative and simply say that I mean, science contributes an evidence base that can help inform decision making, but it's only one component of that. But yeah, so it's about building an evidence base to underpin decision making.
And Catherine said, could you just repeat the question, please, Alicia, because it broke up for her.
Okay, perfect. I just want to know how you see the link between the research that you're doing and the potential to tackle some global challenges. Okay, so there's some really specific ideas here about how you can use science to understand the extent to which trees can be part of a solution to challenges. As Clive said, science is the evidence base.
or part of the evidence base.
Part of the evidence base, tools to kind of realize how serious the emergency is. Thank you for that idea about, as a non-academic, that it's about being able to make a change for the positive. So that's interesting, because for some audiences, science can also be a tool to help empower other people to make a difference to these changes, to these challenges. Understand what the challenges is and the scale of the problem is really important, and expose the kind of opportunities that are available for solutions. Yeah, I like this one about trees adapting to climate change. It's really important for us to understand the extent of the adaptability of the impact.
I think, Alicia, it might. I'd like to get Catherine and Geraint, who are from the same project with different views, apparently, to turn their microphones on and tell us what they're.
Good idea. Let's hear from you. Yeah, go on, Geraint.
Well, I don't think we got different views. I mean, I was going with John's policy of writing the first thing that came in my head, and I should have said science is part of the solution instead of just the solution, perhaps. That's okay.
And Catherine?
I'm not really here. This is I'm meant to be on sick leave, so I'm just typing randomly. So I'm being a bit mean towards Geraint. But I would say we've had these discussions before, that it's definitely a package, because it's not just evidence. It's not the thing that necessarily changes whether or not you walk up to a tree and touch his bark and recognise what a leaf shape looks like in the same way. So I think, there's a spectrum, isn't there, of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's really helpful. Thanks everyone for your contributions. I think, though, to some extent, we can see that everyone here feels that there is a role, at least people who've expressed their opinions, a role that this research can have in terms of having an impact. And for me, then the question is, are we making an effective bridge between the evidence that we have that can be part of the solution, or part of understanding the problem, or part of empowering all kinds of people to take action, or part of that story? Are we sharing that in the different ways and with the right people that it can have that impact? And so the next part of the story is really what can you do to make that work? So let me move on. So I want to ask myself and then you the question: do we understand what success looks like in terms of impact? And I think if you think about the presentation that we heard from the Tree Council earlier, it was pretty evident to me that underneath all of these activities that the Tree Council is taking is a deep understanding of what kind of impact you want to have. And that's something that I would encourage everybody to think really carefully about. So in broad terms, we want to tackle these global challenges, and that means that we kind of could have as our ultimate goal. Here's a photograph of the Paris Climate Change Conference, where they agreed to keep they want to the global goal of trying to keep incremental global warming to well below 2 degrees. That could be our ultimate outcome. But individually, with your piece of research and who you share it with and how you share that, or your program with people, or your other activities with people, whilst that can be the overarching outcome, I'm not sure that it would be fair to peg the success of your outreach and engagement activities on whether or not the world stays below 2 degrees global warming. So what does success look like in terms of the particular things that you're trying to share and the people that you're trying to influence? And you can be quite specific about that to some degree. So understand what success looks like to you. And the reason why that's also important is that when you're undertaking activities that are to do with impact, it can be in some ways quite disheartening, or in fact, kind of impossible to know whether everything you've done has delivered anything. So to give yourself a feeling of satisfaction, understanding what success looks like, and then trying to find your contributing role to that can be helpful, maybe more towards the end stages of achieving impact. So as well as understanding success, this is sort of the kind of questions that you can ask yourself. What are you trying to achieve in the impact space? Who do you need to speak to achieve that? Who is responsible for making those decisions? If we're talking about a policy sphere, there might be either particular policies that you want changed or a particularly strategic approach to an issue. Who are the people who make those decisions? And then you could even think further, who are the people who influence those decisions that are made? Understanding not just who's responsible, but how they make those decisions is really important in being influential in that decision making. And then it's also really helpful to ask yourself a question: what skills do you need to be able to deliver this impact? We've heard quite a bit, again, from the Tree Council now about what it means to be a communicator of science and evidence, and implicit in some of the advice that they were giving you were the kind of skills you need perhaps in writing in a different style. They spoke about delivering and developing relationships with different key stakeholders over a long period of time. And actually the skill set that you need to do this is quite distinctive, and it might not be a skill set that you feel that you have comfortably or that you identify necessarily with the people that you've put together in your crack research team, because those aren't always the skills that are selected for first in those teams. So understanding where those skills lie, what you need, and how you can develop them is important. And I've got a little image here on the right hand side of the very recently published Summary for Policymakers. I would ask for a show of hands, but it's difficult for me to look at absolutely all the screens at the same time while I'm presenting a slide deck. I'm hopeful that some of you have read or looked at this report. If anyone has and they want to comment on what they think about the utility of this report for impact, I'd be interested in hearing their views. So you can just jump in if any of you have read it or looked at it. No, that's okay. It's okay. I'm focused particularly on climate stuff. Well, if you were to open this report, you would find some very, very dense, highly referenced text in there that's quite complex. And actually, although it's described as a summary for policymakers, it's actually a summary developed by policymakers. So it's the challenge with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that to produce these summaries, you need representatives from all 197 countries to agree on every word and every line. And that does not make for the most influential kind of document that's clear and speaks to policymakers and meets them in the place that they might be and with the challenges and specific policy questions that they might have at any time. So I put it here as a kind of an image of an aspiration, perhaps, but not perhaps a best case example. So, think about the impact you're looking for, and then you have to think about how to deliver it. So this is a kind of a horrible, nasty, fuzzy slide, but you can go back to the original in a second. I'm quite a fan of thinking in a very structured way about what you're trying to achieve in terms of impact. And you may have heard the term theory of change, also called a logical framework. It goes in and out of being fashionable. I think it's kind of medium level fashionable now in terms of thinking about what you're trying to achieve. This is the kind of thing that has been traditionally used for a long time in, for example, what was previously known as DFID, so in the development community, but also in some other communities where they develop long-term projects. And the idea here is to really think very carefully about the impact that you want to achieve at the end, which is this green box, and then create a chain of activity from your research at the very beginning on the left-hand side, which is essentially an input, through to the activities that you can do to create certain outputs and then certain outcomes that can lead to the impact you want. It can be more difficult than you imagine to put different things in these boxes, to differentiate between the activities that you might do from the outputs that might generate and the outcomes that might result. But I would say that it's actually a very, very useful exercise, because it's very easy to either get caught at the input end, because a lot of focus of the funding for your project or the place you might feel most comfortable is around the research bit, or some of those other things that you're doing that are actually inputs to impact. It's also very, very easy to get caught in activities or even in outputs, because to develop those is really difficult. So you might think about doing things like writing briefing papers or holding events. Now, those things are activities and they might generate outputs, but you have to really ask yourself quite carefully whether they're going to generate impact. Otherwise, you can do tons and tons of activities very easily that might not be making that connection to impact that you want. So this is a tool that I would encourage people to try and use if you're thinking about having an impact. I've got an example here because it can be really hard to think in practical terms when you see this kind of general categories, like what are these different things? So here I've got an example that's like nothing to do actually with the particular goals that you might have in this project or with climate change actually. But what it does is it tries to clarify the difference here between activities, outputs and outcomes, which for me is the heart of trying to think about impact. And at the end here, they also have a very high level impacts on SDGs, which is kind of similar to us thinking about impacts on climate change or kind of broader environmental impact. So I can share this with you afterwards, but it's this differentiation between what you might do in terms of activities. Like here, they've got support for family farming, things that might then create jobs or improve job quality, change attitudes in the community, and then eventually lead to a kind of these primary impacts that they want. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a case study and something that we did at the Grantham Institute to have impact on policy. But before I do that, I'm just going to make you all big again. Yeah, I like Dee's comment. If only research and outcomes and impacts were so neatly linear. They're not. So this it's not always easy to get this to fit, right? I mean, it's not always beautiful and easy, but to challenge yourself to try and see what fits in there is really helpful. And you know, Jess, your comment is really interesting about theory of change and collaborative projects. These things don't necessarily need to be fixed in stone, but it can be a really good way to talk through with different people what you're doing when you're doing something collaboratively, right? So even seeing that people maybe disagree about what activities can be effective, or by speaking to collaborators, you might find that your idea of which activities are the best activities can be complemented by some other activities by other people that can lead to an impact. Also, things change a lot over time. So just in broad terms, at the Institute where I work, when I joined 7 years ago, our approach was very much that we didn't do anything with the general public. So the kind of campaigns that we were hearing about earlier in this session that are really public facing, we didn't think that was our responsibility. We felt like we had to be talking directly to kind of the people we called influencers, the people that you think of as decision makers, like the people in Parliament and the people in the civil service. But what we also began to realize was that the people in Parliament are only empowered to make decisions about things like climate change if they believe that voters care about it, and that we were missing a trick by not making sure that some of our information was available to and also targeted individual members of the public in some way, whilst it was kind of a vast scale that we weren't equipped and don't have the resources to meet everyone in the public. Making sure that we had complementary activities for the public, we realized was a missing part of our activities and necessary to have the impact that we wanted to achieve. And that was something that we only started to realize over time. And again, that relates, I think, to Jess's comments about like maybe, well, it's not exactly what you said explicitly, but it makes me think about the different perspectives of different collaborators. And you know, not everyone needs to do the same activities necessarily. If everyone's aiming towards the same outcomes, that can also be really valuable. Kate, you've put something really interesting there about the framework that you're using to think about how you have impact and influence. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It was developed by my colleague Johan Siebers, but what I like about it is it gives a kind of orientation that is forward-thinking but practical. So we've just been in Aberdeen for our team retreat, and some of us are still recovering, partly because quite a lot of us had COVID, and I've got a bit of a ex-COVID-y cough, so sorry for my cough. But so what it's about is you start with an archaeological phase of the work, which could be finding out, in our case, how much activism is going on in the UK, particularly around young people and climate change, particularly diverse young people, but also looking at what's going on in terms of climate change and treescapes research, both in social science and in ecological science. And then the ontological phase is actually living with trees. So we've done a lot of work. We've got groups of young people going into treescapes, planting trees, creating treescapes for the future. But that work is actually designed work. So we've been working with landscape architects to design treescapes in Old Trafford and in Aberdeen and Wheeler Forest. So that designing is actually quite intentional. And I think one of the things about working, hopefully, which we're trying to do, is that there's quite a lot you need to put in place, buttresses, to create that structure. You can't just do it. You actually need a lot of people. So, for instance, in Aberdeen, the local authority is totally behind this, and they're making all of early years education outdoors entirely, which is incredible. So you've got these kind of wills behind you and infrastructure. And I think what we're trying to do is work with our partners, particularly in Northwest, Mersey Forest and City of Trees, to create those infrastructures, so strategies. So it means that, I mean, I think this is very helpful for us, but there's this idea of having a layered approach, which both engages stakeholders, engages the public, and engages and actually has an orientation towards change. So that's it, really. But it comes from Ruth Levitas' Utopia as Method.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that, Kate. I think it's really important, some of the things you just said there, that kind of a layered approach, something that's different for different audiences, which is something that came out of the previous session as well. But I think, what I'd just like to reiterate is that thinking through the structure of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how it may or may not work is actually really important. And it's actually more important than starting to just generate tons of things that you think would have an influence and an impact. So don't just shout out into the ether. Think about what those activities and outcomes are, and then speak and work with those important delivery partners, as Kate was saying, to make sure that you've really made the most of all of that potential. And then I think the kind of richness of the approach that Kate just described would be relevant for each of those kind of activity outcome to impact kind of approaches. So there's a richness within this wider framework that I demonstrated that can then be developed. David, you got your hand up.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, this is all great stuff, really interesting. Thank you. I just wanted to flag up a distinction that we're finding very useful in our work in terms of types of impact. Because I think in the whole impact world at the moment, especially with the REF, there's been a real focus on what people sometimes call instrumental impact, where you have a direct impact on policy or practice, and you can show that a policy changed or something very tangible happened on the ground. And that's obviously really nice if you can prove that that's the case. But we found it useful also to acknowledge that often that direct link doesn't happen straight away, and that what you're doing really as researchers is often contributing to a wider debate, possibly reframing problems and getting people to think about problems in a new way, which might create new questions, research questions in turn. So there's a kind of conceptual impact as well as a kind of instrumental impact, which is much broader and less direct, which in turn might lead to instrumental impact further down the line. We found it quite useful to make that distinction, because it opens things up a bit and lets go of this perhaps unreasonable demand that we will have to change policy or increase the number of trees on the ground or whatever it may be. And then beyond that, other kinds of impact as well, like capacity building and just building connectivity, we've found useful as well. So I just wanted to flag that up.
Thanks, David. That's really
complementary.
Helpful.
Yeah,
that's really, really helpful. And I think just going back to what I said at the beginning, it's all about making sure that you define success at the beginning. What does success look like for you? And it may be perhaps unfortunate that frameworks like REF mean that the kind of instrumental impact seems like a superior or is measured in some way as a kind of better. But from my perspective, and for the point of this conversation, I just think it's important that you define your success in those multiple ways, whatever that means to you, and then make a way to kind of plan towards that. I think actually, I really like what you're saying there about not just thinking about instrumental success. I think we have an increasing understanding that, particularly in tackling issues like climate change, a paradigm shift in the way that people think about certain issues, societal acceptance or the societal norms around certain behaviors would make a much more significant difference to some areas of our action on climate change than particular kind of instrumental change, policy regulation. But we need some of everything. But these things are vitally important as well. So, but still can be used within some of the frameworks that we've been talking about. Oh, great, and a reference. Is that the Edwards
Yeah.
D that we see on the screen as
Okay.
well?
Yes,
Brilliant.
that's my colleague Laura Ma, who's on the line as well.
There we go. Fan base. Just making itself apparent.
we worked together for a number of years, and Laura has evaluated a few previous Research Council programs using that framework. But another point, which I think Dee Hedden flagged up, is just about interdisciplinarity and the idea that we're not just talking about science, but we're talking about social science, the arts, humanities, and maybe we need to broaden our conception of evidence as a result of that, and think about different types of knowledge and how each of those might have an impact in complementary ways. You know, you might have the hard science and the economics providing evidence in a kind of cost-benefit analysis kind of way, but then in parallel with that, the arts and humanities might be shaping attitudes and values, which might create a new environment for those for the hard science to make a difference. So these things can complement each other and work in parallel.
Absolutely, I think that's right and really excellently put. And I think that using this kind of framework, what I find really important is to ask yourself, what is the role for the organization that you work with or in? What is this, so when you're thinking about those activities, there's of course 1,000 activities that you could come up with, but thinking about, again, this complementarity of different people in different roles and different organizations, what is the thing that makes most sense for me or my organization to do? Where can we most make the most traction? And recognizing, if you're I work at a science-based university, so I know that I'm not going to be deciding what's the trendy cool thing, but I can speak to people in the Conscious Advertising Network and tell them that I want them to do that in parallel to what I'm doing, and that's the kind of way to kind of create cohesive impact. That's why collaboration is so important, sharing sort of common impact goals and approaches and aligning them. Clive.
I'm just interested, Lisa, if you have a view about how researchers could or should interact with campaigners, with campaign groups who might be very influential and very impactful in their work, but may also have a particular point of view. How does that affect the relationship between the researcher and, as you described earlier, this kind of delivery agents almost?
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna stop sharing my presentation so that I can have more of this conversation, because it's interesting. And Abby, by the way, I realize that we're now like at time, so we'll spend a few more minutes just discussing it, and then you can go on to your session. I'll take that question, then I'll come to John. Okay, so I guess this is partly my personality answering, and then I'll give you maybe a piece of evidence as to why I think I'm right. I basically think you should speak to everybody. I think it's a mistake to draw a barrier of who you work with because you're concerned that they might not agree with you, but also that but it can be very hard. So I had a case study that I didn't speak through just then, but we did quite a lot of work on ocean plastics at the Institute about 5 years ago. And I would say that we were really, really successful in terms of impact, both instrumental and more generic impact. And one of the things that we did was we spoke to pretty much everybody in the spectrum, from Greenpeace through to some private sector people in the plastic space. And actually, we found that if you go and speak to people like Greenpeace headquarters about the evidence around plastics pollution and how it's distributed and how you might want to tackle that and what that means, they were extremely open and interested in understanding the evidence. It didn't necessarily mean that the actions that they proceeded to take were the same ones we may have chosen to take on the basis of that evidence. And that's because their theory of change is maybe different than our theory of change. But actually, in the same way that maybe David spoke about the concerted effort of different actors leading to an outcome, I think it's probably true to say that the bans that we got on single-use plastics were a happy combination of people presenting the technical evidence and people doing the kind of things that they were doing. So what we had to do was also make very clear to them, and they made it clear to us too. I don't think they were particularly keen in people knowing that they had access to all the evidence we gave them, right? But also we didn't want them to say, use us as the name of a person, So for example, they had some big event once and they invited one of our scientists to go. And after a lot of conversation, we decided that he wouldn't go to that event because of the way in which that was being presented. But in other ways, we also spoke quite openly about the conversations we'd had with a wide range of activist groups. So I think absolutely have those conversations and challenge. I mean, we had some quite challenging discussions in that instance about what we thought were appropriate solutions to the ocean plastics challenge based on evidence, and we had a rigorous debate and discussion about that, and I think that was really helpful and added to people on all sides. Another example of this, actually, which was actually some very difficult conversations. Extinction Rebellion is obviously very prominent in the climate change space, and I would argue quite strongly that without the kind of action that they've been taking in other activist groups, we wouldn't be where we are with the net zero target in the UK. But some of the things they say I think are wrong, and I think they're kind of actually technically, scientifically incorrect. And we actually deliberately decided that we would open up conversation, and we wanted to speak to Extinction Rebellion. And there's scientists in Extinction Rebellion, and some of our employees are members of Extinction Rebellion. And we went to some of their events, which felt so different to the kind of events that we run on climate. Really, really different. I can't tell you how different. I could tell you how different. I experienced things I wasn't expecting to experience. But we had a really open dialogue. We had a dialogue about things that, they accuse scientists of being dishonest, which, was quite a stark comment to make. And so we made connections between them and a whole range of climate scientists, and had frank and open conversations, and that empowered us to both go away and continue to take the actions that we were taking that we thought could help move the needle. And they continue to be complementary but different. So yeah, I would say no door closed. And I think then you have to ask yourself, would you say the same thing about the private sector? There are also lots of people doing things, and in particular in relation to trees, I think there are lots of activities taking place now that I would find very concerning, either without evidence base, lots of people with lots of will to do lots of things to do with trees that don't have the time or the access to or the inclination to look at evidence. And so it's equally important that we engage with those communities. Anyway, that was a long answer, so sorry. No, that was basically all just my opinion. John.
Just final thought on that then, Abby, from us. Having spent 20 years dealing in the policy space of trees within the departments, all the different departments that deal with trees, one of the really interesting challenges for all of us is that the assumption is that the people you're talking to are necessarily specialists. They are often not, and the nature of the civil service is that people move on a regular basis. They are given jobs to manage. They are good at their jobs, but they are not necessarily specialists in the topic that we are dealing with. And therefore, the communication of the messaging has to be pitched at the right level for the people that you are dealing with in the government interface. And we should not assume that they are experts, and therefore in very many ways the information that we package needs to be at the appropriate level. So just think about that as we go through this project. How do you package your information, if you want in the policy space, to make sure that it actually gets to the right people? In the end, the ministers want to see a one-page summary of all of this stuff because they haven't got time to read more than a page. So it comes back to that Einstein theory: get it down, get it simple, get it right, get it accurate, but get it short and pithy. And that's how one makes change in our experience, in the policy framework as well.
And maybe I'll just add one more thing to that, and then I'll hand it back to you, Abby. It took a very different route than intended, but hopefully still useful for people. Before I came to work at the university, I worked in a commercial organization, and I had a lot of sales training. I really did not like sales very much, but I actually learned something which I basically apply whole scale to the jobs that I do now, which is that all that sales is about is developing good, trusted relationships with people and listening to them, and then giving them the thing that they now have told you they want. And I think that impact and influence is exactly the same. So all of those people that John just spoke about in the civil service, they basically would really like all of our help. And when you start speaking to them and you build those trusted relationships, then they know that they can come to you and they'll trust you, and they will call you up and they'll ask for something. And a lot of the packaging, I agree with what John said about thinking about the level of expertise people have, but also what I find is, someone actually said to me, about some of the briefing notes we produce. The most important part of the briefing note, well, there's two important parts. The front bit with 3 bullet points that they can share with a senior person, and the back bit, which is a list of references, because they know that we know what the most important references are, and they, because they don't know anything about the topic, can read the top 10 references and then understand the issue, because they're all super smart and their expertise and skill is basically very rapidly coming up to speed with technical issues. So build those trusted relationships and then deliver people the things that is most useful to them in a timely manner. David can have the last word, and then Abby, over to you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sure we're running out of time, but I just really wanted to reinforce that last point about building trusting relationships, because so far this event has been focusing mainly what seems like on one-way comms, on knowledge transfer, on getting that pithy one-page statement right, or the one-line strap line. And to build relationships, often it helps to meet people. And I think in New Leaf, the focus that we've been having, it's not the only focus, but the main thing is just to think about workshops with policymakers to create a safe space to sit down, think through the research that we're presenting to them, think about the implications of that research for policy and practice, and allow people a chance to sort of really reflect and develop actions out of that. So that real knowledge exchange activity rather than knowledge transfer, I think, is an important part of the mix, not surprisingly.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
No problem. Thanks, Elisa. And thanks, David. Yeah, I think that's a really important point actually to raise, is good communications always has some element of two-way dialogue to it. And it's a really important thing. Right, so let me just share some slides. I'm going to run a little bit of an activity now, but I'm just going to talk you through some key points to think about when you go into the activity beforehand. Let me just share my slides. Can everyone see that? Yeah, great. Okay. So my activity is going to focus around sort of building a mini campaign communication strategy or a campaign strategy for your projects. So as we've been speaking about, you really need to be targeted in your approaches and really think about your audience. And a communication strategy is really just the way to start your thinking about how to be targeted to your audiences. It's a way to kind of plan your activities, and it does require some thinking about what exactly it is you're going to say, who you're saying it to. So that's what we're going to work on in this next section. So a good communication strategy has a few things. Firstly, it is time bound, which means that you are setting up your strategy for a specific time period, but it should be a notable period of time. So 6 months to a year is usually a good amount of time. You wouldn't want to create one for longer than that, because you really need to remain reactive to what's going on in the outside world and how your communications activities are going. And it means a good communication strategy means that you need to try and find the, you need to focus on your audience and find the cross section between your goals and the needs of your audience and stakeholders. So a good time-bound audience-centric communication strategy has a few different sections, which I'll run through before I send you off on the event activity. So firstly, it's good to have an overarching objective. This is generally the main goal of your project. You may have goals specifically for communications, but you'll have a main goal for your project, and this won't change throughout the run of your project. So it's just, you can kind of think of it as like a mission statement in a way. So I've put up the Future of UK Treescapes one on the screen, which is to significantly improve the environmental, socioeconomic and cultural understanding of the functions and services provided by UK Treescapes in order to inform decision-making on the expansion of future treescapes for the benefit of the environment and society as a whole, which is a bit of a mouthful. But what it is, and what you can see it is a way to sum up everything that we're going to do or we're trying to do with the Future of UK Treescapes programme. This wouldn't generally be shared outside of your organisation, but it's for you to understand what exactly you're trying to do. Your overarching objective will lead on to your communications goals. So these are just a few bullet points of specific goals that are always linked towards and working towards your overarching objective or your mission statement. And when setting these goals, some of you will be familiar with this format already, but it's really important for them to be smart. So they need to be specific. They need to be quantifiable and specific and relate to your audience. They need to be measurable. So you need to figure out a way that you can say that this goal is actually being seen through and being successful. They need to be achievable and realistic, using your resources and what you have available. And they need to be time-based. So in terms of time-based, they can be, your communications goals can have a time base which is shorter than your entire strategy, but should be within the frame of your strategy. So you wouldn't want to set a goal that you would need longer than a year to complete if your strategy only focuses on a year. The next thing is your key messages. These are just based on where you're at with your project right now. What is it that you need to communicate right now about your project? And what do people need to know about your project? You can also have a little bit of a think when you're thinking about these, about what formats could help with communicating your key messages. So infographics and videos and things like that. So for example, one of the key messages of the Future of UK Treescapes programme is simply like what the programme is as a whole. And so we are commissioning a infographic which will showcase the story of the programme as a whole, looking at geographic locations, all the different sectors we're working with, all of those types of things in a really clear way that will help us communicate that key message. It is really, really crucial, and you should spend a bit of time doing this, defining your audience. We've obviously talked a little bit about different audiences today, but when you are creating a strategy, you really need to be specific about them. And in terms of specificity, I mean, don't just say we're trying to reach adults of this age range. You need to be specific about what kind of adults they are. Are they science interested, or I know some people are theatre based, so theatre interested audience, you try and reach out beyond that. Where are they exactly located, things like that. And then think about the barriers to reaching them. So for example, with policymakers, we've already talked about some of the barriers, but for example, they can only respond to things that their voters need or want. But they also are time poor, so they need things really quickly, which is where you need to come into thinking about their needs. So their needs are based on your barriers as well in that way. The next thing to think about is your communications channels. So this is just essentially where you communicate. As I said, through no fault of their own, previous programs, the projects in those programs have not necessarily thought fully through in a strategic way their communications. So they've figured out what channels are available to them, Twitter, social media events, things like that, but haven't really thought through whether those channels are appropriate for their target audiences. So when you're thinking about your communications channels, in terms of your audience, think about where they congregate, and the cross-section of that between the tools you have available to you and the resources you have available to you. And this is really important so that you're not wasting your time putting messages out into the wrong places. The next part is the implementation plan. So this is where you bring everything that has previously been discussed into one space. So you kind of define the who, what, where, when, and why of your project. One key point is that people tend to need things repeated to remember or to move to action. And generally they need to be repeated to them 3 to 5 times in different ways. So when you're planning a strategy, think about how you can bring in that audience or reach that audience in 3 to 5 ways, in different ways. And lastly, it's really good to build in at the start how you're going to measure things. Now, you've already set up your goals and you've said that they are measurable. So this is just a bit where you say how you're going to measure it, what data you're going to collect over time to measure something. Doing it at the start means that you know what you're going to be collecting. You can look into resources that are available for you. And then afterwards, you move on to refinement at the end of your strategy. Look back, what was successful, what wasn't, how can you refine this for future strategies? So with all this in mind, in a minute, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for working through the workspaces that I've set up for you. I've set up basically these Google Slides, and I just want you to go through the different sections. There are instructions on the pages, which hopefully make sense to you, but if not, you can send me a chat message and I will pop into your room. Throughout, otherwise, if I don't get a message, I'll just be going through different rooms and checking everything and contributing to discussions. Just before we go, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll put these details in the chat in a minute, but does anybody have any questions before we move on to that bit? Just going to have a look at the chat. No? Okay, if there are no questions before we move on to the workspaces, I will just put the information in the chat and then I'll set up the Zoom rooms so you can go into them. If you end up in a Zoom room on your own, do send me a chat message and I'll try and sort that out. But there you go, those are the rooms. Please do go to the one that is assigned to your project in the chat.
Hello.
Welcome back. I think that is everybody back in the main room. Right, so just a few comments to close, really. Just hopefully everyone found that activity useful. I will be sharing all the resources from this whole event with everyone, so you'll be able to work through it a bit more with your team if you were finding it useful in some way. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we close the meeting today? Just wave at me if you do. Or how did you find that activity?
Well, I can say that in our group, we mostly had Work Package 5 representatives and kind of felt a little bit early days still, because there's still quite a lot of research to be carried out, and I think the findings of the research will then inform the outcomes of a or the production of a comm strategy. So but bearing in mind all the things that we've spoken about today with the theory of change and your proposed structure of a strategy, I think would be really useful to bear that in mind as everyone goes through their work. So I'm afraid we haven't come up with a strategy or anything yet, but it's certainly
it was only a thing to start people thinking about these conversations and talking about where they might go. So if you're not at the point where it works for your package yet, then that's fine. But that's, sharing the resources will hopefully mean that you can come back to them in the future when you are at that point.
I would dearly love to see at the end of all this the 5 to 10 word summaries of all of the 6 major projects. So if you want to, if any of you can put a 6 word, 10 word, no more than 10 word summary of your projects that we could all have as a collective for Clive and Abby to use in part of that overarching comms, it would be brilliant to have those. So for each of the 6, it is 6 projects, isn't it?
Right now, yeah.
Yeah. Just use that stuff you did on the hedges and give us the 6 word, 10 word summary of your project. I think it would be brilliant to see them.
It feels though at the moment that you can provide a short summary of what you're trying to achieve, but we're not quite ready to produce the sort of 6-word key message that we want to get out to the rest of the world, and that will come later. So it's, I think there's
Kate's done hers. Children plant trees and change the world. I like that.
Lovely.
If that summarises the whole of that project, Kate, then that is exactly what we need to start exploring the links.
Yeah.
Vadim did his. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, and think about how you're going to plant your trees better, I think was Vadim's, give or take.
Don't put all your trees in one basket. I like it.
All your trees in one basket, yeah.
Okay,
I think
great.
Claire said something really interesting earlier when you spoke about how we should remember that some people see trees as a source of risk and all kinds of other maybe negative things. I think one of the trickiest things in communicating is to really, really take yourself out of it and think about some very, very different kinds of people and attitudes. I kind of find that challenge. I work with someone who works in insurance, so he always thinks trees are about to lead to house disaster. So that's always a good sense check for me.
Okay, great. So that's kind of, we've reached the end of the session. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully it was all useful and food for thought. And hopefully we'll see you at future sessions as well. Thanks all. Bye.